The aims of this training are to explore the 8 different sensory systems and to understand the impact of sensory processing difficulties, exploring that as a feature of autism, as well as offering some practical support on how best to manage these needs within a classroom and making reasonable adjustments and interventions to hopefully reduce the anxiety these children are facing. In order to receive a diagnosis of autism, a child needs to present with difficulties in a number of different areas. Communication can often be challenging for children on the autistic spectrum. This can be the acquisition, production, and delivery of speech, and often there is involvement from speech and language therapy from an early age. The communication difficulties frequently extend beyond this remit and impact numerous other areas of communication, such as shared attention, engagement, body language, and eye contact. Compounding this, there is a difficulty with social interaction that can impact initiating social interaction, interpreting social cues, and maintaining friendships. Difficulties with flexible thinking and imagination do not mean that children with autism are not creative. It means that they crave predictability and routine, often demonstrating reluctance to engage with things that are unpredictable or unexpected. This rigidity of thought can lead to intense or obsessional interests or ritualistic behaviours that are soothing to the individual. Previously, this was known as the triad of impairment. However, it's now increasingly recognised that there is a 4th area of need within autism, that of sensory processing difficulty. In fact, 90% of people that receive a diagnosis of autism have sensory processing difficulty, and it is an area that can underpin much of the anxiety that children within the classroom are facing. Whilst it's true that sensory processing difficulties are common within autism, the reality is that we all have difficulties with processing our senses at some point in our life, and will all show sensitivities in certain sensory areas. Have a look at this slide, thinking of yourself. Are there any items here that cause you particular discomfort, or that you find particularly enjoyable? Here are some of the most common sensory issues, and when this training is delivered within a staff meeting, everybody seems to be able to identify something they struggle with. For many, this is just a minor inconvenience, but for some, it causes them to make adjustments to their everyday life in order to avoid or seek out this particular sensory input. This means that on some level, all of us can appreciate how it feels for our senses to influence our responses. Sensory processing is our ability to discriminate and filter between the sensory information that is coming into our systems all the time. This enables us to attend and focus upon only the relevant information that needs to be processed. This definition was provided by occupational therapy, and it is often occupational therapists who are called in to support students with significant sensory processing difficulties. For people with sensory processing difficulties, the sensory information that is coming in is overwhelming, arriving all at once and bombarding their concentration, focus, and attention. Within the classroom, this has significant impact on the children's capacity to attend to the information that they were giving them and to actively listen to the learning. Often, these children appear as hyperactive and hypervigilant, a state that resembles ADHD, and some suggest sensory processing difficulties can be mislabeled as ADHD. So let's look at our senses in more detail. We have the 5 common senses: sound, smell, taste, sight, and touch. But there are also 3 additional senses that impact our everyday lives without us always realizing. The first is our proprioceptive sense. This provides us with information about where our body starts and stops in space. It's our spatial awareness and is linked with the pressure and force that we use as we move. The second is our vestibular sense. This is our awareness of our bodies moving through space. It's linked with the inner ear, and this sense provides us with more information about our balance. The third is interoception. This is the sense that interprets the internal messages within our body. For example, the messages that tell us we're hungry, thirsty, hot, cold, or when we need the toilet. In order to process these senses, we need not only to receive information from all of them, but to receive the right level of information. For those with sensory processing difficulties, they can demonstrate hypersensitivity to one or more of these areas, meaning that they are over-processing the information, becoming very sensitive to it and often avoidant of it. Alternatively, they can be hyposensitive, meaning they are not receiving enough of that information and so crave greater input from that sense, resulting in a need to gain greater sensory input and demonstrate sensory-seeking behaviours. We're going to look in more detail at each of these 8 senses, and I'm going to provide examples of children I've worked with who have struggled processing a particular sense. I will try to provide examples of children who are both hypersensitive and become avoidant, as well as those children who are hyposensitive and seek greater sensory input. Sensitivities towards sound are one of the most common sensory processing difficulties that we become aware of in our classrooms. For many children, loud noises are overwhelming and frightening, and they become avoidant of places that amplify these noises, such as lunch or sports halls. For many, it is not only loud noises that they struggle with, but busy places that generate a cacophony of sounds that need to be filtered. Whilst listening and watching to this PowerPoint, you might be mildly aware of clocks ticking in the background, or the hum of a light bulb, or the buzz of a fridge. But you're able to filter these out so that your attention is focused on the information it needs to process. Imagine if all these sounds around you were at the same volume, competing for your attention. If this were the case, it would make sense that you would want to cover your ears or remove yourself from the busy environment. It is suggested that children that show extreme sensitivities may actually have better hearing than the peers around them, and so be able to hear noises, frequency, and pitches that we come out, almost like a superpower or a spidey sense. Ear defenders are now common practice to support children to block out some of these extra sounds, and I'm sure you've seen these or supported children to use these within your classroom. Oddly, it is often the children that are sensitive to loud noises who make the loudest noise themselves. I've seen a young boy standing in the middle of the classroom screaming at the top of his voice that it was too loud, with his hands over his ears, and the adults around him confused because he was making the situation far worse. But for him in that moment, it was about control. He was amplifying his own noise to control and block out some of the din around him and make it controllable. Other children are hyposensitive to noise and in fact crave an ongoing soundtrack to their lives. These are often the children who will talk to themselves or hum to themselves or make repetitive noises and vibrations. These children may be soothed by listening to music or even just to white noise. These children may still become distressed when there is a loud, unpredictable noise, and it is the familiarity and predictability that they crave. For many children, it is their sense of smell and the processing of smells around them that is impacted, and once again, they might have a heightened sense of smell. I was supporting a boy in primary school who became a school refuser when he moved into Year 6. He had had difficulties with emotional regulation throughout his school life, but it escalated in Year 6 and he refused to come in. When we investigated this situation, it turned out that he had started coming to school by himself, taking the bus each morning. For him, getting the early morning bus with crowds of people and the smells of their breakfast and their coffee was so overwhelming it made him physically sick, and he could not face doing it anymore. It is not uncommon for there to be a correlation between sensory processing difficulties and school refusal. Equally, I've worked with a young girl who was hyposensitive to smell in that she craved certain strong smells. This need to gain greater input dominated much of her concentration, and she would try to meet this need whenever she could. Often this was in an inappropriate manner, and she would sniff objects, clothing and hair. Understandably, as she grew older, her peers were uncomfortable with this. Thankfully, the class teacher was skilled at making reasonable adjustments and set up a smell station at the back of the classroom. The girl was encouraged to complete one piece of work before going to her smell station, opening a pot of choice and giving it a jolly good sniffing. This met her needs just as scratching an itch would, and she felt soothed enough to return to her desk. Taste is a very common sense to be affected in sensory processing difficulties, and we frequently support children who have a restricted diet in some way. The most common diet we see is the beige diet, children who will only eat bland beige food, often with very limited variety and often repeated every day. We know that autism is a lifelong condition, and so such a diet can have significant implications on lifelong health. I worked with a boy who was hypersensitive to taste. We began to notice a decline in his mood in the afternoons and traced it back to lunchtimes when he was secretly sliding his tray of food into the bin and not eating anything. When asked why he was doing this, he said that the food had no flavour and that it made him feel sick. When we spoke to his mum, she explained that he put hot chilli sauce on everything and would not eat anything without a very strong flavour. By recognising this need, addressing it, making the adjustments, we were able to encourage him to eat his lunch and consequently saw a decline in challenging behaviours in the afternoon. For some children, this sensitivity means that non-food items will also go into their mouth. It is important to be mindful that this issue can be caused by a number of different things. It can be craving of different tastes, but can equally be a response to different textures and might not be about the consumption of the items. It is also important to advise parents to discuss this with GPs because there can be an unknown deficiency that needs to be addressed. Some children's visual input is affected, and I've worked with children who are very sensitive to natural light, needing to wear sunglasses whenever they go outside. I've recently met a young adult who struggles when the day is cloudy and there is a white coverage in the sky, but does not experience the same discomfort when the skies are clear and it's sunny. For others, it is artificial light that causes them discomfort, and they would prefer to be in the dark, often choosing to switch off lights and draw curtains. For children that are hypersensitive, they can crave different visual inputs. Currently, I'm working with a young girl whose favourite activity is to sprinkle sequins and glitter in front of her eyes. For her, this activity is so soothing and mesmerising, she could focus upon doing it all day. If she isn't provided with time to do this activity, she will orchestrate it herself, tipping water, food, toys and resources to gain the same kind of feedback. It's not uncommon for some children to flicker their fingers at the corner of their vision to alter the light input, enjoying the kaleidoscopic effect. It is not uncommon for children to be sensitive to touch. Many will seek out physical contact and present as boisterous, while others are avoidant of this and flinch at any touch. For the latter, the processing of tactile stimulus can create a physical pain response, and it is not uncommon for even the lightest touch of someone brushing past them to cause pain. These same children may crave a deep pressure response and enjoy strong physical contact such as squeezing or leaning into people. Often we see children who are very sensitive to the clothing they wear and become distressed by labels and seams. For children that need to wear school uniform, this can be an even bigger issue. I've worked with children who refuse to wear anything but loose clothing and would remove their clothing if they could, and other children that wear clothing and shoes that are too small for them just to gain the tight, deep pressure squeeze. Such a sensitivity to touch extends to personal hygiene as well, and it is very common for children on the autistic spectrum to struggle with activities such as brushing their teeth, washing their hair, and even taking a shower. Some young adults I speak to find the feel of the water from the shower painful, and so become avoidant of this and many other personal hygiene activities, which in turn causes a number of additional issues for them as teenagers. Similarly, haircuts are a very common area of distress, and so self-image is therefore dictated by their difficulties processing sensory information. Proprioception is our awareness of where our body is in space. Even when we're not observing our movements, our proprioceptive sense tells us how much space there is around us. It tells us how much pressure we need to put on our feet as we're walking, on our bodies as we're sitting, even on our jaw as we're chewing. Proprioception difficulties can look like clumsiness, poor coordination, and weak gross motor skills. In order to gain information about where their body is, these children may lean into you when they sit next to you, or run their hand along the edge of the table as they navigate themselves through the classroom. Walking and running can be impacted by proprioception difficulties, and children may appear unsure of how much pressure to put down on their feet as they walk, giving an awkward gait. There is much overlap with difficulties with this sense and dyspraxia. Some children crave greater proprioception feedback and will push themselves against things and even their peers. They may squeeze themselves or enjoy heavy activities in which they carry weight. Building in greater opportunities for such activities can be very soothing for them. The vestibular sense is our awareness of balance and movement through space. If you hate roller coasters, you could be described as vestibular avoidant. If you love roller coasters and the feeling of being out of control and falling, you would be described as someone who seeks vestibular input. It is linked with the inner ear and can be associated with motion sickness. For some children, being hypersensitive to the vestibular sense results in them feeling unbalanced and out of control when they move. They may hate activities that involve jumping, spinning, or even running. Whilst other children who are hyposensitive seem to not be able to get enough sensation of moving through space and so seek out opportunities to swing, hang upside down, climb and jump, often with disregard for safety. In the classroom, we often see these children rocking and spinning, seeking greater feedback wherever they can. The final sense to talk about is interoception. This is our capacity to interpret, understand and respond to the internal messages within our body, such as temperature regulation, hunger, thirst, and even needing the toilet. We often work with young children who struggle to identify when they need the toilet and so remain in nappies considerably longer than their peers. Interoception difficulties can explain the children who go outside in the winter without their coat, unaware of the cold, or refuse to take their coat off in the heat of summer. Equally, this is linked to the children who may run around all of break time, not recognising that they're dehydrated and need a drink. Or those children that continually eat, not recognising when they're full up. The impacts of sensory processing difficulties can be significant. Often these children are so overwhelmed by their need to avoid or gain sensory input that it is all they can focus on. With their senses being bombarded continuously, anxiety levels rise, often resulting in poor emotional regulation and escalation to aggression and crisis. For others, the meltdowns are internalised and these children become passive, withdrawn and shut down. Often adults working with children with autism and sensory processing difficulties describe them as controlling, stubborn and manipulative. And yes, they are. These children live in a world that feels out of control and so seek to take control to create predictability wherever they can. This need for predictability to ease their anxiety levels explains why these children struggle with change and transition and crave routine. For many children that are processing much more of the sensory information around them, they can quickly become exhausted, tired from trying to filter out excessive sensory input. Many children learn to avoid situations of high sensory value, such as social interactions and bustling environments. Whilst we know difficulties in social communication are common traits within autism, the social isolation we see can be driven by a need to reduce unpredictable sensory input as well. By spending time alone from others, they are controlling some of that sensory information. For many children, their difficulties with regulating sensory information is very apparent, whilst others will mask these issues. In order to fully understand a child's sensory needs, we need to build a sensory profile, looking at each of the 8 areas of sensory input, identifying which are causing triggers, and whether these senses are over or under responses. It is very common for children that mask these anxieties in the school environment to present them more readily and release them in the home environment, and so it is crucial to talk to people that know the children best. Ask family members that they live with about their sensory needs. Talk about the specifics of their diet or their personal hygiene routines. Ask them what triggers their anxieties most. If it is appropriate to do so, ask the child themselves. When I had concerns over a sensory processing difficulty for a Year 6 boy, I asked him about specific areas that I thought he was struggling with, and he was amazed that there was another human that could understand these difficulties. He had been so careful to mask these issues, thinking that he alone was suffering. Completing a sensory profile is a very useful strategy, and these will be available from your Senko. It is useful to get both school and home to complete a profile so you get a complete picture. Observations are vital. If it is possible, observe the child both in the classroom and on the playground, and watch out for the small behaviours, the ones that they are perhaps trying to mask. They will indicate difficulties with processing a certain sense. I imagine that whilst reading and listening to this information, you have been picturing different children that you work with that demonstrate some of these issues. It could be that they experience difficulties processing one of these senses, or more likely it is that they have difficulties processing a number of them, that they overlap and are difficult to unpick. So what should you do first to support these children? The first thing you're doing already, you're increasing your knowledge of sensory processing difficulties so that when you observe the behaviours, you understand the needs that are being communicated. These children will often struggle with regulating their emotional responses and consequently their behavioural responses. Initially, these children will need adults to co-regulate and teach them how to appropriately seek or avoid the senses that are dominating their attention. There are a number of interventions that can be used to provide children with sensory breaks bespoke to their sensory profile, scaffolding activities that can be alerting or calming. As the children engage with this co-regulation, they will begin to recognise the benefits of the activities that are meeting their sensory needs. They can then adopt them themselves, beginning to self-regulate. At this point, the children will have a better understanding of what their triggers are, how they can avoid them, and how to self-soothe. Some children will also need an environment adapted for their sensory profile, and reasonable adjustments can be made to help meet or avoid the sensory input. It is important to remember that children will always find a way to seek or avoid the sensory information they're struggling with. It is not something that can be stopped, rather it needs to be redirected. Frequently, these children try to meet their sensory need in inappropriate manners or at inappropriate times that interrupt the learning within the classroom. It is therefore essential that we provide them with strategies and opportunities to regulate their sensory needs in appropriate ways. Providing regular scheduled sensory breaks tailored to their sensory profile should be delivered at least twice daily. The adults working closely with these children should also provide responsive sensory breaks when they observe their sensory behaviours escalating. For example, if you notice the child that you're supporting is rocking on the carpet, sitting on his hands or squeezing himself tightly, allow him to complete 3 quick sensory activities such as chair push-ups, pushing the wall or lifting a heavy box. He will then feel more regulated to go back to the carpet and focus on the learning at hand. There are many intervention programs out there that suggest different sensory activities. Jane Horwood's Sensory Circuits is a useful book that we often recommend to schools. Other children will need the environment adapted to support their sensory needs. For example, some children cannot tolerate the noise and bustle of the classroom for extended periods, and will demonstrate this by raising their own volume to muffle that of others around them. By providing them with a low sensory environment, or even just an individual workstation away from the class walkways, they will be able to better regulate their sensory input, freeing up their capacity to concentrate on their learning. I hope that this training has given you an insight into sensory processing difficulties, providing more information on the 8 different sensory systems and the impact each can have. Hopefully, it has provided insight to individual children you're working with. By unpicking the individual sensory needs and creating a bespoke sensory diet, you can support them, initially with co-regulation and then teach them to self-regulate, the lifelong skill that will enable them to manage their sensory processing needs themselves.